Hello. My name is Julia Dawson, and I never imagined the battlefield I would have to fight would be inside my own family home. I had survived combat drills, deployments, sleepless nights under mortar fire, and the silence of desert nights where every breath mattered. Yet nothing prepared me for the night my own brother leaned over me and cut off the oxygen tube that kept me alive. The hiss of the air stopped. The sound that had become background music to my recovery suddenly vanished. My chest seized like a fist was closing around my heart. My hands clawed at the mask as panic roared through me. I had trained for emergencies. I knew how to steady breath when under fire. I knew how to keep control when adrenaline spiked. But this was different. This was betrayal dressed in my brother's familiar face. Ethan Dawson, 32, looked down at me with eyes colder than the desert night. His lips curved in something that was not quite a smile, more like satisfaction. My lungs screamed for air. I tried to remember what we were taught in combat casualty care control, the intake. Slow the exhale by seconds, but my body fought me, demanding oxygen that was no longer there. I gasped a sharp sound like a wounded animal. My mind flashed to the training field where instructors yelled, "Adapt and overcome." I told myself to stay conscious. My legs kicked against the sheets as though I could fight air itself. The room blurred. The world tilted. My vision tunneled to a narrow pinhole. Ethan's voice reached me through the fog. He whispered almost playfully, "You were always the weak one, Julia. Maybe the world does not need you." The words pierced deeper than the suffocation. This was not a stranger. This was my blood. My chest convulsed again, and I fought to push out sound, a scream, a call, anything. All I managed was a guttural rasp. I reached for the emergency button, my fingers stiff, my arm heavy as lead. My training told me stay alert, find comms, signal distress. My body betrayed me. In those seconds, my soldier's discipline clashed with the raw terror of a daughter who realized her own brother wanted her erased. The door creaked open. For a breath, I thought rescue had come. My father, Richard Dawson, stepped into the room, tall, rigid, his posture still screaming naval officer, even though he had long retired. His eyes landed on me, gasping, clawing at the mask, Ethan standing beside the bed with the tube dangling in his hand. Any father would have lunged forward. Any father would have shouted, "What have you done?" My father only shook his head, the coldness of command filling the air. His voice cut sharper than the lack of oxygen. "Stop overreacting, soldier. You always make a scene." Those words slammed into me harder than a blow. Overreacting. Scene. As though I had chosen to suffocate myself. As though I had staged my own body convulsing on the bed. The betrayal burned worse than the suffocation. I felt tears prick the corners of my eyes, but I forced them back. Soldiers do not cry in front of the enemy. That is what he had made me believe all my life. My body sagged back against the mattress. Blackness crowded the edges of my sight. My training said never give in to the dark fight until the last breath. But what happens when the breath itself is stolen by family? My fingers brushed the plastic of the call button, but strength slipped away like sand through my hands. In those last moments of consciousness, I told myself, remember every detail. A soldier records. A soldier survives. Then the darkness swallowed me whole, and the last sound I carried into unconsciousness was not the alarm, not the rush of footsteps, but my father's clipped sigh of annoyance, as though I was once again the inconvenience, the problem, the daughter who never measured up. When I woke the next morning, sunlight was spilling through the blinds in dull strips across the hospital-style bed set up in my old room, and the oxygen tube had been reattached, the steady hiss returning like a cruel reminder that survival sometimes depended on thin plastic. My body ached, but my mind was sharper than ever, trained to take inventory of a scene, just as I had been taught in the service. Assess environment, identify threats, catalog details. I lay still and allowed memory to replay the night before my brother's hand on the tube, my father's words cutting colder than steel. They had left me alive but weaker, perhaps hoping weakness would silence me. Instead, it lit a fire. To understand why their betrayal ran so deep, you need to know the Dawson family. My name is Julia Dawson, 28 years old, Army medic once stationed in Afghanistan. I was deployed twice, saw dust storms that blinded us, carried wounded men across burning sand, and held IV bags steady while rockets thundered nearby. My service left me with scars inside and out, the worst being a heart condition after an explosion rattled me off my feet. Doctors said I needed oxygen during recovery, a crutch I hated but one I relied on. In uniform, I was Sergeant Dawson, disciplined, steady, respected. At home, I was still the little girl, dismissed by a father who valued obedience more than compassion. Richard Dawson, 60, had spent his career in the Navy, his chest full of medals, his mind rigid with protocol. He raised me not with lullabies, but with orders barked as though I were a cadet. He saw discipline as love and failure as disgrace. To him, Ethan was the golden son. Ethan, 32, handsome, charming to outsiders, had once tried to follow our father's path, but washed out of officer training. His resentment toward me only grew when I excelled in Army medical school. Where he saw my strength, he saw his own weakness reflected back. Margaret, my stepmother, 58, was the quiet shield that always covered Ethan's sins. She was soft-voiced in public, yet her loyalty was not to truth, but to the illusion of a perfect family. When Ethan crashed a car in college, she told the police it was her fault. When he failed tests, she blamed teachers. And when he cut my oxygen, I knew she would find words to excuse him too. That was the Dawson family balance, Richard issuing commands, Margaret smoothing lies, Ethan basking in the role of golden child, and me, Julia, cast as the weak link, the problem, the one who always had to prove herself. Coming back home after my medical discharge was not supposed to be a battlefield, but every detail reminded me otherwise. The dining room still carried the scent of polish and starch, as if the walls themselves were ordered to stand at attention. My father's voice echoed in every hallway posture, straight eyes forward, no excuses. Ethan strutted through the house like he owned it while Margaret hovered close by, whispering reminders about keeping peace. They saw me not as the soldier who had patched wounds under fire, but as the fragile girl with tubes, the daughter who needed pity, the sister who needed to be controlled. I had learned to compartmentalize during service. A medic in combat cannot afford to fall apart at the sight of blood or cries. You lock the fear in a box and keep moving. That training helped me now. I observed my family the way I would assess locals in a volatile village, noting expressions, tone patterns. Richard avoided eye contact. Ethan smirked whenever I adjusted my oxygen line. Margaret fussed over the table settings, but never over me. This was intelligence gathering. This was reconnaissance on the enemy I happened to share blood with. I knew then that surviving in this house would require more than oxygen. It would require strategy. It would require remembering I was not the helpless daughter they wanted to paint me as, but a soldier who had carried comrades out of fire. They might strip me of recognition here, but I had carried the uniform, and that uniform had taught me to endure. As I sat at the kitchen table later that day, the oxygen tube hissing softly beside me, Ethan leaned against the counter and said in his lazy drawl, "You look like a machine plugged into that tube, Julia. Maybe you should have stayed overseas." My father glanced up from his newspaper and added without a flicker of sympathy, "Don't start drama again. You always overreact." Margaret chimed in softly, "Let us keep peace at the table, dear." 3 voices aligned against mine, the familiar chorus of dismissal. But this time I was cataloging, not caving. I marked every word, every look, every betrayal. A soldier prepares, a soldier adapts. And though they saw me as broken, I knew the battle had only begun. The days that followed were meant to be quiet recovery days, but nothing in that house was ever quiet, and for me, every sound carried threat. The steady hiss of the oxygen became my companion, a reminder that I was alive, yet I noticed changes. One night, while adjusting the mask, I heard a faint sputter in the line as though airflow was interrupted. I checked the gauge, the reading lower than before. My instincts sharpened. In Afghanistan, I had learned that details save lives. A shadow out of place could mean an ambush, a sound in the dark could mean incoming fire. Now I saw the same patterns inside my own family home. The flow was inconsistent, sometimes weaker, sometimes fine. I logged the times in my notebook like I had logged supply runs in the field. Evidence mattered. The next morning, I asked my father if someone had touched the system. He did not even lower his newspaper. His jaw tightened and he muttered, "Stop making a mountain out of nothing. Julia, adapt and overcome. That is what soldiers do." Ethan chuckled from the couch and added what kind of soldier needs a tube to breathe. His smirk burned into me. Margaret brushed past with coffee, saying softly, "Let us not ruin the morning." That was the family pattern. Question dismissed, insult added, pretense of peace layered on top. My suspicion grew. The tube connection seemed tampered with tiny scratches near the joint. I had cleaned weapons in the desert. I knew tool marks when I saw them. Still, when I mentioned it again, my father barked a laugh and said, "Paranoia is not discipline." The words cut deeper than the oxygen line ever could. Soldiers learn to trust gut instinct, but in that house, every instinct of mine was labeled weakness. I started keeping the notebook hidden in my duffel, logging each irregular flow, each smirk from Ethan when the hiss faltered. One afternoon, while resting in the living room, the line went slack again, and panic surged in my chest. I steadied myself with the breathing drill we had practiced under simulated gas attacks. Slow inhale, slower, exhale, conserve. My hand trembled as I reached for the valve. Ethan's eyes were on me, and when I caught his gaze, he simply mouthed dramatic. My father saw my distress, and instead of stepping forward, he snapped, "Julia, you always overreact." His tone was clipped like a command. Margaret touched my shoulder, but it was the touch you give a child throwing tantrum, not a daughter gasping for air. That evening, I replayed every interaction. The dismissal was constant. They wanted me to doubt myself to bury suspicion under guilt. Gaslighting. In training, we were warned that psychological warfare breaks soldiers faster than bullets. My family had perfected it over years. The constant narrative that I was fragile, needy, dramatic. It had shaped me as a girl, but I was not that girl anymore. I was a medic who had kept men alive with one hand pressed to an artery and the other holding a radio. I reminded myself of that truth while writing in the notebook. Entry 2100 hours, flow irregular again. Ethan nearby. Father dismissed concern. Mother minimized. Pattern confirmed. This was not paranoia. This was intelligence gathering. Still, the weight of their voices pressed hard. At dinner the next night, I adjusted my tube and Ethan muttered, "Maybe you should not even be here." My father barked, "Just eat your meal and stop fussing." Margaret whispered, "Let us keep peace." Their words boxed me in. For a moment, I almost tore the notebook page out, almost erased the record. That is what they wanted: silence. But soldiers do not erase. We record, we log, we prepare. My chest ached as I finished the note, but my resolve stiffened. The gaslighting hurt the dismissal cut, but beneath it all, I felt something stir. The same determination I had felt when rockets fell near our aid station, and I told myself, "You cannot collapse now, men depend on you." Here, too, my survival depended on refusing to collapse under their narrative. They could call me dramatic, fragile, paranoid, but I knew patterns, and the patterns screamed danger. It happened on a night so ordinary it should have been safe, yet in toxic families, danger hides behind routine. I had finished a simple meal alone because my father and Margaret had gone out and Ethan had claimed he was working late. The house creaked with the sound of pipes, the hiss of the oxygen steady beside me, and for a brief moment I felt almost calm. I had logged 3 irregularities that day, each dismissed with the same cruel refrain, "You always overreact." And though anger boiled in me, I tried to breathe through it. I sat at the small desk in my room, pen in hand, noting down flow readings like a soldier recording supply drops. Then the hiss changed. At first, it was subtle, a stutter as though someone had stepped on the line, then silence. My chest seized, instantly panic exploding in my mind. Training shouted, "Remember the drills, control, conserve." I forced a shallow inhale, but nothing came. My body demanded air, clawing, convulsing. I grabbed the mask, checked the line, and then I saw him. Ethan standing in the doorway, his hand on the valve, his face lit with something close to triumph. He whispered, "Maybe the world does not need you." "Julia, maybe I will finally be the one who matters." My vision blurred as I tried to shout, but all that came was a broken rasp. My hands shook violently, yet instinct took over. In combat, I had once crawled through dust with a wounded man slung across my back, lungs burning vision. Dimming, but step by step I had reached safety. Now I used that same stubborn crawl, dragging myself off the bed toward the call button on the wall. My knees scraped carpet, my fingers trembled, my head pounded with each beat. Ethan stood frozen for a moment, then laughed under his breath, dramatic as always. My chest screamed for air pain, shooting down my left arm. I clawed another inch. The world tilted like I was back in a Humvee, rolling after an IED blast. I fought to stay conscious, fought like a soldier in hostile territory. Just as my hand brushed the button, the door opened again. My father's boots struck the floorboards with the rhythm of command. For a fleeting second, I thought he would save me. That instinct stronger than cruelty would drive him to shove Ethan aside and restore the line. Instead, his voice lashed out like a whip-stop, overreacting soldier, you embarrass yourself. Ethan smirked behind him, mask of innocence slipping back into place. My father's cold eyes locked on me, not on the disconnected tube. He saw only a daughter weak enough to need oxygen, not a medic who had held lives in her hands. My strength drained. Darkness pressed at the corners of my vision, and my body collapsed sideways onto the floor. The last thing I registered before slipping under was Ethan lifting the tube, casually, my father turning away as though the scene bored him, and Margaret's distant voice calling from downstairs asking if everything was fine. Fine. That word echoed in my mind as I lost consciousness. When awareness returned, sterile light burned my eyes, and beeping filled my ears. ICU. The world resolved, slowly monitors blinking wires on my chest IV needle in my arm. My breath came through a regulated mask, clean and steady. A nurse adjusted dials. My body was alive, though battered, my mind sluggish but remembering. Beside me sat my father, posture, upright expression, unreadable. Margaret hovered behind him, wringing her hands. Ethan was nowhere in sight, but I could almost feel his smirk lingering in the air. My throat rasped as I tried to speak. Father. His eyes flicked down, and his hand pressed mine too tightly. His voice was low, almost a hiss. Say nothing. Julia, do not ruin your brother's life. Family business stays inside family. I wanted to scream, to tell the nurse to call the MPs, but weakness chained me. Instead, I stared into the flat line of his gaze and realized that this was not just one incident, not just one tube. This was war declared silently within the walls of my own home, and I was the only soldier willing to fight it. Lying in that hospital bed with monitors tracking every fragile beat of my heart, I could not escape the weight of memory pressing against me like a tide. The collapse had not been an isolated storm. It was the inevitable result of years spent under a roof where cruelty passed as discipline and silence passed as love. My mind slipped back to childhood, like a reel of training footage unspooling whether I wanted it or not. I was 12 when my father Richard first decided that being his daughter meant being a cadet in his private boot camp. He lined me up in the backyard at dawn, the dew still clinging to the grass, and barked commands: left face, right face, about face, faster, straighter again. When I stumbled in the wet ground, he snapped his belt against the porch rail and warned, mistakes mean punishment. Ethan, 2 years older and already favored, watched from the kitchen with a smirk sipping orange juice while I fought to keep tears from falling. Soldiers do not cry in front of the enemy. I whispered to myself, repeating the creed that was supposed to give me strength, but instead built walls around my heart. Years later, during a blizzard, Ethan locked me in the garage as a prank. The temperature dropped so low, frost rimmed the window glass, and my breath came out in painful clouds. I pounded the door until my fists ached. When my father finally found me, he laughed, calling it field training, and Margaret soothed Ethan, saying, boys will be boys. I learned then that in the Dawson household, pain was entertainment when it belonged to me, and any protest was labeled drama. At West Point, when I earned my appointment, my father stood stiffly beside me during orientation, but instead of pride, his words were sharp. Julia, remember, failure disgraces the family. Ethan never reached that level, but when he flunked out of officer training, my father made excuses, and Margaret whispered that academics are not everything. Yet when I brought home commendations from instructors, they dismissed them as luck. The double standard burned deeper than the blisters on my boots. I remembered the time I collapsed with fever during summer leave. Margaret barely looked up from her novel while I lay sweating, murmuring for help. Ethan told friends on the phone, "My sister is always sick, always needy," and when I gathered strength to confront him, my father scolded me for disrupting the household. Even then, the refrain had begun, "You always overreact." It became the family's favorite weapon, sharper than fists, more effective than chains, because it carved into my sense of reality. Over years, I carried that refrain like a rucksack full of rocks. In Afghanistan, when mortars rained down and my squad scrambled for cover, I forced myself to keep moving, telling myself, do not overreact, keep steady, stay useful. That voice born in my father's living room became survival mechanism and prison both. Now, as I lay in ICU, the pattern was undeniable. Cutting my oxygen was simply the latest escalation in a war that had been waged quietly for decades. Ethan's smirk had grown sharper as years passed, his envy festering with every success of mine, his cruelty masked as jokes. Richard's coldness had hardened into stone, every word delivered like an order, every glance heavy with judgment. Margaret's passivity turned into complicity, smoothing over Ethan's sins, urging me to let things go for peace. Peace that never included me. The flashbacks surged, and I let them, because as painful as they were, they reminded me that none of this was imagined. Gaslighting loses power when the victim catalogs truth. I saw the frost in that garage again, felt the fever sweat on my skin, heard the snap of the belt against the rail, the dismissive laughter at every stumble. These were not scenes invented by paranoia, they were lived battles. I clenched my hands around the hospital blanket and told myself, you are still that soldier who patched wounds under fire. You are not their scapegoat anymore. Every memory was evidence, every scar was proof. The chain of abuse stretched back through years, linked by indifference, polished by gaslighting, reinforced by silence. But chains can break. My breath steadied as the monitor beeped a rhythm like marching boots. I was alive. I had survived ambushes overseas, and I had survived the ambush within my own blood. And now, with clarity as sharp as a field knife, I promised myself I would not be gaslit into silence again. The past had shaped me, but it would no longer control the mission ahead. The day after the collapse, I woke determined that I would not wait for another ambush inside my own home. I would prepare, as a soldier prepares for hostile terrain. My body was weak, but my mind snapped into mission mode, and mission parameters were clear. Identify enemy intent, gather intelligence, secure proof. In Afghanistan, I had learned that suspicion was not enough to call in support. You needed coordinates, patterns, evidence. I decided to treat my own family like the volatile village elders we once had to negotiate with smiling faces hiding hidden weapons. The first step was surveillance. I ordered a mini camera online, small enough to fit inside the first aid kit on my bedside table. When it arrived, I installed it carefully, angle facing the oxygen valve. I disguised it among gauze pads just as I had hidden radios among supply crates overseas. I tested the recording and watched grainy footage of myself adjusting the mask, satisfied that it would catch any hand tampering with the line. Next came audio. I slipped a recorder under the couch cushion in the living room where my father often lectured and Ethan lounged. I remembered field ops where we planted listening devices in abandoned schools, and I applied the same steady hands. Each evening, I reviewed snippets through headphones, writing timestamps into my notebook. Most was mundane, yet even in small talk venom seeped through. Ethan's voice one afternoon carried clearly. She thinks she is still a soldier, but without that tube, she is nothing. My father's reply was low. Let her exhaust herself, she always exaggerates. Margaret's sigh floated in the background. We must keep peace, Richard. I logged every word. Still, I needed more than insults. I examined the oxygen tank closely and found fresh tool marks around the regulator. I photographed them with my phone, lining the images like evidence slides. In combat, we were trained to build case files of insurgent activity photographs, maps, witness statements. Now I was building a case against my own blood, but soldiers never work alone. I knew I needed backup. I reached for my cell and scrolled to a number I had not used in months. Captain Ryan Miller, my former commanding officer, a man who had once pulled me out of a blast crater and who had always told me, "Dawson, you see details others miss." I pressed call. When he answered, his voice was steady, a soldier's voice. I whispered the code word we had established long ago for emergencies, Raven Black. There was silence. Then his reply understood. Situation compromised report. I told him about the collapse, the tampered line, the dismissals, the smirks. He listened without interruption, then said, "Collect and secure data. Keep daily logs. I will run background checks." My chest eased for the first time in days, knowing someone believed me. That night, I documented everything in military format, time, date, incident, observation. I even wrote suspected motive, Ethan resentment, Richard denial, Margaret cover, evidence log file 1. Each entry steadied me, turning chaos into order. Days later, Ryan called back. His tone carried gravity. He said, "Julia, the oxygen supplier on your last refill was not the authorized distributor. The paperwork shows your father's signature on a change request." That was confirmation. My suspicion was not paranoia, it was fact. I stared at the phone hands trembling, then wrote in bold letters on the log, "Deliberate tampering confirmed." I looked around my childhood room, now transformed into an intel cell. Camera red light blinked faintly. Recorder hummed notebook pages filled with tight script. I felt alive with purpose. In combat, the line between fear and clarity is razor thin, and I felt that razor now. They thought they had reduced me to weakness, but instead, they had triggered the soldier instinct, the relentless drive to finish the mission. Margaret knocked on the door bringing tea and asked gently why I always scribbled in notebooks. I smiled faintly and answered habit from service. She left satisfied, unaware she had walked past a war room. That night, when Ethan entered casually fiddling near the tank, the camera caught his hand twisting the valve. His face leaned close as he muttered, "Pathetic." The next morning, I downloaded the footage to a secure drive and sent a copy to Ryan. Backup secured. My heart pounded with a mix of fear and triumph. Evidence was no longer whispers in my head, it was pixels and sound files undeniable. The mission was progressing. Phase 1. Complete gather intelligence. Phase 2 awaited confrontation. I whispered to myself like a mantra, a soldier does not fold. A soldier fights until proof becomes victory. The confrontation came during Thanksgiving dinner, a holiday that should have been filled with warmth and gratitude. But inside the Dawson house, it was another stage for performance. Margaret had polished the silver. Richard sat rigid at the head of the table, as if presiding over a court-martial, and Ethan leaned back with his glass of wine, grinning like a man who believed the world bent for him. I took my place slowly, my oxygen line hissing softly, the faint sound a reminder of why I was there, and why I could no longer remain silent. For days, I had gathered evidence footage of Ethan's hand twisting the valve recordings of my father dismissing my pain photographs of tool marks around the regulator. The logbook lay hidden in my duffel, but every line of it was etched into my mind. As Margaret passed turkey slices across the table and Richard began his customary speech about duty and honor, I steadied my breathing, reminding myself of missions overseas, when timing meant life or death. I chose my moment carefully. When conversation lulled, I placed my fork down and said in a calm, steady tone, "We need to talk about what has been happening in this house." Ethan laughed immediately, shaking his head as though I had cracked a childish joke. "Dramatic as always, Julia. Can you not even let one holiday be normal?" My father's eyes hardened and he barked, "Julia, sit down and apologize to your brother." Margaret touched my arm and whispered, "Let us not ruin this day. Keep peace." But I remained upright, hands flat on the table. I repeated my words firmer this time. "Ethan tampered with my oxygen line, and I have proof." Silence fell across the table. Knives paused halfway, eyes wide. Ethan scoffed louder, leaning forward saying, "You are imagining things. Everyone knows you crave attention." My father's jaw clenched, his voice sharp. You dishonor us with these accusations. Margaret shook her head, pleading softly. Julia, please, do not escalate. That was when I reached into my pocket and placed my phone on the table. I tapped the screen and audio filled the dining room. Ethan's voice captured clear as day. Maybe the world does not need you, Julia. Maybe I will finally be the one who matters. The words hung in the air, heavier than smoke after an explosion. Margaret gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. Richard's face drained of color before flushing red with rage, not at Ethan, but at me. Ethan's smirk faltered, then returned as he muttered out of context. She twisted it. I pressed play again, another clip, my father's voice low. Let her exhaust herself. She always exaggerates. Margaret closed her eyes in shame, but still tried to whisper excuses. The evidence reverberated around the table, undeniable, unfiltered. I looked each of them in the eye and declared, "This is no longer my paranoia. This is documented truth." Ethan slammed his glass down and snapped, "You are trying to destroy the family name." My father roared, "Enough, Julia. You will regret this defiance." Margaret cried, "Please stop, all of you," but I had already crossed the line and there was no going back. My voice shook, but I did not lower it. I will not be your scapegoat anymore. I will not sit silently while my own brother tries to choke the life out of me and my father calls it overreaction. I am a soldier and I know how to stand my ground. The table was frozen turkey, cooling, untouched silverware gleaming under tense light. Ethan's eyes burned hatred. Richard's face twisted with fury. Margaret wept, but still shielded them. Yet for the first time, the power shifted. I had pierced the gaslighting with undeniable proof. They could yell, they could threaten, but they could not erase what had been recorded. That night ended without resolution, Richard storming from the table, Margaret following in tears, Ethan retreating to his room, but I sat alone staring at the flickering screen of my phone, replaying the clips, not for doubt, but for resolve. The evidence was no longer mine alone. It was ammunition, and I was prepared to take this battle from the dining table to a place where justice could no longer be ignored. The courtroom smelled of polished wood and old paper, a place where truth was supposed to carry weight heavier than lies. And as I walked down the aisle with my oxygen line tucked carefully at my side, I felt the eyes of strangers fixed on me, some with pity, some with curiosity, all waiting for a story to unfold. Captain Ryan Miller sat behind me, a steady presence reminding me that I was not fighting alone this time. Across the room, Ethan sat with his lawyer, his posture relaxed but his jaw tight, the confidence of the golden child beginning to crack under the harsh light of public scrutiny. Richard stood beside him, rigid as ever, arms crossed like an officer inspecting troops, while Margaret dabbed at her eyes as though tears could erase complicity. The judge called the session to order, and my lawyer rose, presenting the evidence like a battle plan laid out on a briefing table. First, the photographs of the tampered regulator, then the video clip of Ethan's hand twisting the valve, then the audio recordings of whispered cruelty and cold dismissal. The courtroom listened in stunned silence as Ethan's voice filled the air. "Maybe the world does not need you, Julia." Murmurs rippled through the audience, reporters scribbled notes, and Ethan's face turned a shade paler. His lawyer objected, claiming context, claiming fabrication, but the judge overruled. Then came my turn. I stood, legs trembling, but spine straight the way I had once stood in formation under desert sun. I looked at the judge and said, "Clearly, I am Sergeant Julia Dawson, United States Army medic, and I will not be silenced by the people who tried to suffocate me." Gasps echoed, and my father slammed his fist on the table, shouting, "Enough, you disgrace this family!" The judge pounded his gavel and ordered silence, but the damage was done. The mask my father had worn for decades cracked in front of strangers. I continued, my voice steadier now, recounting the night of the collapse, the hiss stopping the crawl toward the call button, the words, "Stop overreacting, soldier," from my own father as my brother watched me gasp for air. My throat tightened, but I forced the words out because this was not weakness. This was testimony. This was truth finally free from the prison of gaslighting. Ethan jumped to his feet, shouting, "She is lying!" She always was dramatic, but the judge ordered him to sit down, and in that moment, his rage was no longer hidden behind charm. Margaret wept louder, pleading with the judge to consider family peace. But the gavel struck again, and peace was no longer an option. Ryan rose briefly to testify that I had contacted him using the distress code Raven Black, a code reserved for life-threatening emergencies, and that he had verified the irregularities with the supplier. His calm soldier's voice lent weight that no family denial could counter. My lawyer then played the final clip. My father's words let her exhaust herself. She always exaggerates. The silence that followed was heavy, suffocating in its own way, but this time it was my family who struggled to breathe under the weight of truth. The judge leaned forward, eyes sharp, and asked Ethan directly, "Did you tamper with your sister's oxygen line?" Ethan sputtered, eyes darting, mouth opening and closing, until finally he muttered, "She deserved it. She thinks she is better than me." The words slipped out like poison, and the room erupted. Reporters gasped. Spectators shook their heads, and I stood taller than I ever had in my father's house. For once, Ethan's cruelty was not brushed aside. For once, my father's silence was not protection. For once, Margaret's tears did not wash away accountability. This was public, undeniable, irreversible. As the judge restored order, I closed my eyes briefly and whispered to myself, "You are not overreacting. You are surviving. You are testifying. You are winning." When I opened them again, Ethan was slumped in his chair. Richard glared with fury, but also fear. Margaret clutched her tissue like a lifeline. I remained standing soldier straight because this was the battlefield where I would finally claim victory, not with weapons but with truth. When the verdict finally came down, the air in the courtroom seemed to thicken, every breath heavy with the weight of years of silence about to shatter. The judge's voice was firm, steady, carrying none of the hesitation my family had used to twist reality. He declared Ethan Dawson guilty of attempted manslaughter and medical tampering, sentenced to 15 years in prison, the gavel striking like a rifle report, sealing his fate. For a moment, Ethan's mask of arrogance held his lips curled in a smirk, but when officers stepped forward to cuff his wrists, the smirk cracked into panic, his eyes darting toward Richard as though their father could command the world to stop. Richard rose halfway, his voice booming objection. "This is family business." But the judge's glare silenced him, and for once, his authority meant nothing. Margaret sobbed loudly, clutching her purse like it was armor, but even her tears could not soften the truth. The judge turned to Richard, his words cutting as sharp as any blade. "For obstruction of justice and falsification of supplier records, you will serve 5 years probation under strict supervision." Richard's face tightened, a vein pulsing in his temple, and though he did not look at me, I felt the searing heat of his hatred as if he were burning holes through the air. Margaret was stripped of any legal control over household medical decisions, her pleas for mercy drowned beneath the simple truth that silence is complicity. As the gavel struck again, a rush of relief surged through me. Not triumph exactly, but release, as though invisible chains had finally been broken after decades binding my chest. Reporters scribbled furiously, cameras flashed, and for once the Dawson family's perfect facade crumbled before the world. My lawyer leaned close and whispered, "You did it, Julia. You won," and I realized victory was not in seeing them punished, but in knowing the truth had finally been acknowledged outside the prison of our home. Ethan shouted as officers led him away. "She ruined everything, she disgraced us," but his words fell powerless into the air. No longer gaslighting, no longer believed. Richard stood stiff, refusing to meet my eyes, but the tremor in his hand betrayed the collapse of the empire he thought he had built. Margaret reached toward me, whispering, "Please, forgive. Please, remember family." But I stepped back, my posture soldier straight, and answered, "I remember everything. And that is why forgiveness cannot erase accountability." The judge's sentence was not the end of pain, but it was the beginning of justice. In that moment, I felt years of being silenced lift the refrain of "you always overreact," finally drowned beneath the voice of authority that said no, she was right. Outside the courthouse, microphones pressed toward me, questions shouted, lights glaring, and I steadied myself before the crowd. I said, "I am Sergeant Julia Dawson. I served my country with honor, and I will not apologize for surviving my own family." Gasps, rippled applause broke out from a few, and I felt something I had never felt under my father's roof: validation. For once, the truth was stronger than the lies. Ethan was led away in chains. Richard faced the humiliation of probation. Margaret's tears failed to shield her, and I walked free. Not just from the courtroom, but from the suffocating history of being branded dramatic, fragile, less than. The consequences were real, the record permanent. My family's name now carried scandal, but for me, it carried liberation. The oxygen tube hissed softly as I breathed deep, each inhale a reminder that survival is itself defiance, each exhale a declaration that justice had finally been served. After the courtroom doors closed behind me, I stepped into sunlight that felt different than any light I had known inside the Dawson house. Not harsh, like judgment, or cold like silence, but warm, steady, real. The hiss of my oxygen was still there, a quiet reminder of fragility. But for the first time, it did not feel like weakness. It felt like proof that I had survived everything they tried to take from me. I found a modest apartment near the base where I had once served a place small, but mine, with walls free of commands and air that was truly my own. I decorated it slowly, a photograph of my unit on the shelf, my Army medic patch framed above the desk, the logbook of evidence locked away, not as a weight, but as a record of victory. Each morning I walked to a nearby cafe, breathing in steam of coffee and chatter of strangers who did not know my story, but whose kindness reminded me that not every family is cruel. Healing did not come fast. Nights still brought dreams of tubes cut and voices dismissing me, but I learned to steady my breath, whispering to myself, "Soldier, you are safe. You are free." One afternoon, I passed a bulletin board outside the cafe and a flyer caught my eye. Support Group for Survivors of Family Abuse. My chest tightened, but curiosity stirred. The next week I went. The room was filled with people carrying scars on the inside and outside, each one telling fragments of pain that echoed my own. When it was my turn, I stood and introduced myself not as the weak daughter or dramatic sister, but as Sergeant Julia Dawson, survivor of both war overseas and war inside my family home. Faces nodded, eyes glistened, and I realized my story could carry weight beyond myself. I returned week after week, first as participant, then as organizer, helping others put words to their silenced battles. In sharing, I felt pieces of my own soul knitting back together. Ryan visited, often reminding me that comradeship does not end with discharge. We ran drills with new recruits, teaching them not just combat medicine, but resilience of mind, telling them that scars are not signs of failure, but of endurance. Standing in front of those young soldiers, I saw myself not as the girl dismissed at a dining table, but as a leader whose pain had become instruction. Months later, I ran my first mile without the oxygen line lungs burning, but free, each step pounding against the pavement like a drum of defiance. At the finish line, I stopped chest heaving and whispered to the wind, "They cut my oxygen, but they never cut my will to live." The words felt like prayer, like vow, like closure. Letters began arriving from people who had read about the trial strangers, telling me my courage had given them strength to speak out, to confront, to survive. One message simply said, "Your story saved my daughter's life." Tears welled, but this time they were not of despair, but of gratitude. My scars remained, yes, but they no longer controlled me. They were medals etched into skin and memory testaments to battles fought and won. I built a new rhythm: mornings with coffee, afternoons at the support group, evenings training recruits, nights breathing steadily without fear of footsteps in the hall. Freedom was not loud or dramatic. It was the quiet certainty that I was no longer captive to their voices. Richard's glare, Margaret's excuses, Ethan's smirk. All of it belonged to the past, locked away in records and verdicts, powerless over me. The soldier in me had not been destroyed. She had been reforged in fire, and now she stood taller, steadier, breathing her own air.